The snow didn't fall that night. It attacked. Sideways, sharp, and relentless, carving through the December air above the glass bowl stadium. Under those frozen lights, 11 men huddled together, steam rising from their breath, waiting for one voice. And at the center stood Chuck Ely, calm, silent, unblinking. His eyes didn't flinch. His hands didn't shake. He had done this 34 times before, and every single time he walked off the field a winner. But this one felt different. This was the end. The last throw of his college career. The last time he'd wear the Toledo uniform that had never seen defeat under his command. 35-0. The kind of record that should have made him a legend before he ever stepped into the NFL. A storybook career. A quarterback who didn't just win, he defined winning. Coaches called him unbreakable. Teammates called him unshakable. Opponents called him unstoppable. And yet, as the crowd roared and the snow painted history across the field, Chuck knew something no one else did. He could feel it in the quiet corners of his mind that even perfection wouldn't be enough. Because in 1971 America, perfection had a color. When the final whistle blew and the cheers echoed across Toledo, the headlines should have written themselves. Ely finishes career undefeated. But behind those bold letters, the story would change. The stats were there, the records were real, but something invisible stood between Chuck and the future he'd earned. The scouts didn't call. The agents didn't reach out. The league that claimed to chase greatness suddenly went silent. They said it quietly, never on the record. He's a great athlete, but... The word but carried more weight than his 35 wins. More weight than his trophies, his championships, or his leadership. Because to them, Chuck Ely wasn't just a quarterback, he was a black quarterback. And in 1971, that made all the difference. It wasn't about talent. It was about tradition, a coded system that still believed leadership had a skin tone. To them, intelligence, composure, and command belonged under white helmets. Everyone else. They could run, they could catch, but they couldn't lead. Not in the huddle, not on the field, not in the NFL. So when Chuck Ely stepped off that frozen field for the last time, he wasn't just walking away from a game, he was walking straight into history's blind spot. America had its next great quarterback right in front of it, but chose to look away. Because acknowledging him meant admitting the truth, that the barrier keeping black quarterbacks from leading teams wasn't about talent, but fear. And as the snow fell harder that night, covering the footprints he left behind, Chuck didn't know that his journey was only beginning, that the silence from the NFL would become the spark for one of football's most important revolutions. If you're enjoying this video and loving the content, don't forget to give us a big thumbs up. It really helps us know what you want to see more of. And why keep all the excitement to yourself? Share this video with your friends, family, or anyone who loves NFL drama. Because sometimes, history doesn't start with applause. It starts with erasure. By 1971, America had changed, or at least it liked to pretend it had. The marches were over, the speeches had faded, and the photographs of raised fists had become museum pieces. On paper, the walls of segregation had fallen. But on the football field, the old rules still whispered in the locker rooms and echoed through the scouting reports. And for black quarterbacks, the message was the same as it had been for decades. You can play the game, but you can't lead it. Chuck Ely knew that long before his phone never rang. He'd heard the stories, Marlon Briscoe, the magician, who broke barriers in 1968 by becoming the first black starting quarterback of the modern NFL. He threw for nearly 1,600 yards that year and led his team to victories they weren't supposed to have. And how did the league reward him? They converted him to wide receiver. Just like that, erased from under center, rewritten into a different role. The message was clear. Black men could perform but not command. That same unspoken rule was waiting for Chuck. Scouts smiled politely, told him he had great athleticism, natural instincts, and unmatched drive. Then came the pivot, the same rehearsed line, disguised as advice. You'd make a great defensive back. It was their way of saying, you're talented, but not the right kind of smart. Not the kind of calm and calculating leadership that white quarterbacks supposedly owned by birthright. It wasn't just racism, it was branding. The quarterback wasn't just a position, it was a symbol. The league had built its image on the idea that the man commanding the huddle represented poise, intellect, and control. And in 1971, that image was still painted white. For executives and coaches, the idea of a black man telling white players where to line up was unthinkable. They didn't say it out loud. They didn't have to. Every draft snub, every position change, every maybe next year carried the same hidden translation: know your place. But Chuck Ely didn't fit inside their categories. He wasn't loud or brash. He wasn't the stereotype they expected. He was quiet, composed, surgical with his throws, the kind of leader who earned belief through performance, not personality. And that terrified them, because he didn't fit their excuses. He broke every mold they built to contain him. The only thing they could use against him was his skin. So when draft day came and went without a single call, Chuck didn't crumble. He didn't plead for a tryout or switch positions to make someone else comfortable. He did something no one expected. He refused to wait for permission. If the system didn't want to change, he'd leave the system behind. Because while America kept clinging to its color lines, Chuck Ely was already stepping across them, toward a new country, a new league, and a chance to play the position the world kept trying to take away from him. The morning Chuck Ely left Ohio, the sky was gray, heavy, unmoving, the kind of sky that seemed to understand what he was about to do. There were no reporters, no fanfare, no cameras waiting by the bus stop. Just a man with one duffel bag, a folded suit, and a dream his own country refused to recognize. He kissed his young daughter goodbye, told her he'd be back soon, and boarded a bus bound north, not to another state, but another chance. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing freedom. For Chuck, this wasn't exile. It was escape from the walls of a league that measured worth by the color of skin, not the content of performance. America had told him no with a smile. Canada, at least, was willing to listen. When he stepped off the bus in Hamilton, Ontario, the air cut cold, but something inside him warmed. There were no questions about his intelligence, no whispers about leadership, no polite suggestions to try defense. They handed him a playbook. They handed him a uniform, and with that, they gave him something he'd been denied his entire life: a fair shot. The Hamilton Tiger Cats weren't just taking a chance on a new quarterback. They were embracing a man who had been ignored by an entire system. His teammates didn't see a statement of protest. They saw a competitor. His coaches didn't see a risk. They saw a leader. The barriers that defined American football didn't seem to exist here, or at least, they didn't matter nearly as much. It was football, pure and simple. No politics, no coded language, just the game the way it was meant to be played. From the first snap, Chuck made sure everyone knew why he'd come. His throws cut through the Canadian wind like glass. His reads were lightning quick. His poise in the pocket, the same composure that once scared American scouts, now inspired confidence in Hamilton's locker room. He wasn't just fitting in, he was taking over. The same calm that silenced college stadiums was now electrifying an entire country. And as victories began to pile up, something else happened, something powerful. For the first time in his career, Chuck Ely could just be a quarterback. Not a black quarterback, not a controversial player, just a man under center commanding the huddle with quiet authority. The headlines in Canada didn't talk about his color, they talked about his leadership, his vision, his wins. That bus ride from Ohio to Ontario wasn't just a trip, it was a rebirth. Chuck had crossed an invisible border between rejection and recognition, between being ignored and being seen. America had told him he couldn't lead. Canada handed him the ball and said, "Show us." And he did. Because when a door closes on greatness, sometimes you don't wait for it to open, you find another way in. When the 1972 season began, most fans in Canada didn't know Chuck Ely's name. He wasn't a top draft pick, or a media darling, or a household face on TV. He was just another quarterback, a quiet American newcomer stepping into a foreign league with nothing but a shot. But by the time that season ended, he wasn't just known. He was legend. The CFL had seen talent before. What it hadn't seen was a man playing like every snap was a second chance. Chuck didn't arrive with the arrogance of a savior. He arrived with the calm of a man who'd been doubted his entire life, and was finally free to prove the doubters wrong. Every throw, every read, every touchdown was a message to everyone who had ever told him, "You can't." It didn't take long for Hamilton to realize what they had. Ely wasn't just managing games, he was commanding them. His precision on deep balls, his pocket poise under pressure, his ability to rally teammates in silence, it was mesmerizing. The Tiger Cats, who had stumbled through inconsistency the year before, suddenly looked unstoppable. The city of Hamilton began to buzz with something new, belief. And Chuck Ely became their heartbeat. Week after week, he dismantled defenses, racking up wins and silencing critics across the league. Reporters came expecting to find a feel-good story, a polite American cast-off trying to make it work up north. Instead, they found a quarterback outplaying everyone. He wasn't surviving in Canada, he was dominating it. By the end of the regular season, the rookie had done the unthinkable. He led Hamilton to the Grey Cup. A first-year quarterback, a black man who had been ignored by the NFL, a player with no professional experience. And now, he stood on the biggest stage in Canadian football, one win away from immortality. The game itself was brutal. Cold wind, pounding hits, and a crowd roaring so loud it felt like thunder trapped in steel bleachers. But through it all, Ely stayed unshaken. Every drive was methodical, every decision calculated. Late in the fourth quarter, with the game hanging in the balance, he delivered, slicing through the defense, orchestrating a drive that sealed the victory. Final score: Hamilton Tiger Cats 13, Saskatchewan Roughriders 10. Chuck Ely, undefeated rookie season, Grey Cup champion, Grey Cup MVP. In 1 year, he accomplished what generations of players had been told was impossible. And he did it without bitterness, without boast, just brilliance. The same league that had once shut its doors to him now had to watch from across the border as Canada crowned him king. In 1972, while the NFL's old guard still whispered about intangibles and leadership, Chuck Ely was busy embodying them, in a different country, on a different field, under a flag that didn't care about the color of his skin. The rookie didn't just rule Canada. He rewrote the story of what a quarterback could be.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button.
For most athletes, winning a championship means you've made it. It's supposed to be the moment that cements your name in history, that final proof you belong among the greats. But for Chuck Ely, his crowning achievement in Canada marked the beginning of something else: silence. When he lifted the Grey Cup in 1972, newspapers across Canada called him the miracle rookie. Fans hailed him as the future of the CFL. But back in the United States, the country that had refused to give him a chance, it was as if nothing had happened. Major American sports outlets didn't run front-page stories. The NFL didn't call. There was no parade of headlines, no acknowledgement that a man they'd ignored had gone north and become a champion. It was almost as if they wanted to pretend he didn't exist. For a league that had celebrated itself as progressive and bold, the NFL's silence spoke volumes. Chuck's success wasn't just inconvenient, it was embarrassing. He had exposed the hypocrisy of a system that said, "Black quarterbacks can't lead," and then watched him prove the exact opposite the moment he got the chance. The narrative was supposed to be that the league was not ready, that the game was too complicated, or that there weren't enough examples of black leadership at the position. But now there was an example, a clear, undeniable one, and instead of celebrating it, they buried it. In sports history books, Chuck's name faded into footnotes. The CFL recognized him, sure, but in the NFL's collective memory, he was barely a whisper. Decades passed, and even as black quarterbacks like Warren Moon, Randall Cunningham, and later Donovan McNabb broke through, few ever mentioned the man who'd done it years before, the one who had walked so they could run. And that wasn't an accident. The American football establishment had no incentive to resurrect the story of a man they'd refused to draft purely because of the color of his skin. It was easier to pretend the barrier had never been there, or that the progress had been natural. Chuck Ely's existence disrupted that narrative, and so they simply erased him from it. Interviews with former players and coaches show how deep that denial ran. Many admitted they had heard of Ely's dominance, but they were told not to compare leagues. The unspoken message was clear. If greatness didn't happen in the NFL, it didn't count. But that mindset came at a cost, not just to Chuck, but to the generations who never got to hear his story. The man who shattered stereotypes, who went undefeated as a rookie and won a championship, was left to watch history pass him by. No calls from the Hall of Fame, no recognition from the league that turned its back on him. Chuck Ely didn't just get erased from the NFL's story. The NFL erased a piece of its own truth. For decades, Chuck Ely's story existed in fragments, whispered among diehard fans of the Canadian Football League, passed down by teammates who couldn't forget his poise, or mentioned briefly in documentaries that never reached American screens. But while the NFL erased his name from the record books, time has a way of uncovering what history tries to hide. Chuck never chased fame. After his Grey Cup victory, he played a few more seasons in the CFL before injuries caught up with him. When his playing days were over, he didn't storm into the spotlight demanding recognition. Instead, he settled into life away from the roar of the stadium, working in finance, raising a family, and speaking quietly about perseverance, leadership, and the importance of character. To many, it seemed like the story had ended there, but it hadn't. Because in the shadows of forgotten history, something powerful was growing, a legacy built not on trophies, but on impact. Ely's daughter, Cindy, would later share stories of her father's resilience, his unwavering calm under pressure, and how he never once spoke with bitterness about the NFL. Instead, he used his experience as a lesson, that sometimes the world won't open the door for you, and when that happens, you find another door. And that's exactly what he did. In Canada, the respect for Ely never faded. The Hamilton Tiger Cats still remember him as the rookie who brought them glory. Fans who were there in 1972 speak about him with reverence, not just for what he accomplished, but for how he carried himself. He never made excuses, never lashed out, never let anger define his story. And yet, his quiet dignity was its own form of rebellion. In an era when rage might have been justified, he chose grace. That choice, though it came at a personal cost, became a lasting example for the generations that followed. Years later, when black quarterbacks began to dominate at every level, from college to the pros, the echoes of Chuck Ely's story started to surface again. Scholars, journalists, and fans began to ask, why wasn't he ever given a chance? Why isn't he remembered? That question, once buried, became impossible to ignore. Chuck Ely may not have a bust in Canton, but his influence runs deeper than statues or speeches. Every time a young black quarterback steps onto the field, confident and unafraid, a small part of Ely's spirit walks with them. He was the proof that greatness doesn't need permission, only opportunity. The quiet legacy of Chuck Ely is a reminder that erasure doesn't erase truth. It only delays its discovery. He didn't need to shout his name into history. His story eventually found its voice. And though America once looked away, it can't anymore. Because the record might forget him, but football never truly did. For years, Chuck Ely's story floated in silence, a ghost in the margins of football history. The NFL had moved on, crowning new heroes, celebrating new firsts. But time has a way of circling back, of demanding that forgotten truths be heard. And as the decades passed, the world finally began to catch up to Chuck Ely. The first cracks appeared in the 1990s. Sports historians started to revisit the stories that didn't fit the NFL's self-congratulatory timeline. They looked at the facts: a 35-0 college record, a Grey Cup championship as a rookie, and an undefeated career as a starter, and realized something was missing from the official narrative. That something was a man the league had quietly left behind. Then came the players, men like Warren Moon, Doug Williams, and later Donovan McNabb, Russell Wilson, and Patrick Mahomes. They didn't just break barriers, they shattered them. And when people asked how, their answers often traced back to a lineage that started long before their time. Warren Moon, another black quarterback forced to play in Canada before the NFL would take him seriously, once said he stood on the shoulders of the ones who came before. Chuck Ely was one of those shoulders, sturdy, steady, and unacknowledged. By the 2000s, Ely's story was no longer just a footnote. Documentaries and features began to surface, finally giving his journey the spotlight it deserved. In 2012, the University of Toledo inducted him into its Hall of Fame, a long-overdue honor for the quarterback who had once carried their team to perfection. That same year, the CFL enshrined him as one of its all-time greats. Canada had never forgotten. America was just beginning to remember. When journalists finally asked Chuck how he felt about being overlooked, his answer was simple, almost disarmingly so. He said, "I never played for attention. I played for the people who believed in me." There was no bitterness, no anger, just a calm understanding that truth doesn't need validation. And yet validation came, slowly. In classrooms and locker rooms, his name started appearing in lessons about leadership and resilience. Sports podcasts unearthed his stats. College teams invited him to speak about perseverance. For the first time, young athletes were hearing his name not as a what-if, but as a pioneer. Time had caught up, not with vengeance, but with clarity. The narrative that once excluded him began to shift, piece by piece, until Chuck Ely was no longer a forgotten quarterback from Toledo, but a foundational chapter in the evolution of the game. Today, when you see a black quarterback leading his team to a championship, you're not just seeing the present, you're seeing Chuck Ely's future realized. The future he built when the world said no. He may have played in silence, but time made sure his echo would never fade. History has a habit of rewarding the loud, the celebrated, and the spotlighted. But Chuck Ely's greatness lived in the opposite direction, quiet, defiant, and unshaken by the world's refusal to see him. He didn't need a camera or a commissioner's blessing to validate what he already knew. That excellence doesn't ask for permission. It proves itself. Ely's journey wasn't built on protest signs or fiery speeches. It was built on quiet rebellion, the kind that doesn't shout but simply acts. When the NFL told him to change positions, he didn't argue. He just left. When they said a black man couldn't lead, he didn't fight for approval. He just led anyway. And when they tried to erase him from the record, his legacy found new life in the generations that followed. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He was trying to play football. But sometimes, the simple act of doing what you're told you can't do becomes the most powerful statement of all. Chuck Ely never saw himself as a victim of racism, even though he faced it at every turn. He saw himself as a man of purpose, someone who knew that his job was to prepare, perform, and persevere. When the door shut, he didn't pound on it. He built his own. That quiet dignity became his signature, and it's what made his story impossible to bury forever. Even now, decades later, you can trace his influence in the poise of every young quarterback who refuses to be boxed in by stereotypes. You can see it in the way players like Jalen Hurts or C.J. Stroud carry themselves, disciplined, focused, unmoved by doubt. They are heirs to the mindset Chuck lived by. That leadership has no color, and respect is earned by doing, not asking. In a world obsessed with validation, Chuck Ely became the ultimate contradiction, a man who didn't need the system's approval to prove his worth. His greatness wasn't measured by contracts or endorsement deals, but by courage. By the way he handled rejection without resentment. By the way he won with grace in a country that welcomed him when his own would not. And maybe that's the truest definition of victory. Not the trophies or headlines, but the ability to stay true to yourself when everything around you says you shouldn't. Chuck Ely didn't just play quarterback, he redefined what it meant to lead. Without slogans, without protest, without permission. His story reminds us that sometimes the most radical act is believing in yourself when no one else will. He walked away from the league that doubted him and built a legacy that outlasted it. No approval, no permission, just greatness. And in the end, that's what made him unstoppable.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.